The Dirt with me, Mike Howell, an economics podcast where I present the down and dirty agronomic science to help grow crops and bottom lines. Inspired by eKonomics.com, farming's go-to informational resource, I'm here to break down the latest crop nutrition research, news, and issues, helping farmers make better business decisions through actionable insights. Let's dig in. Well, hello again, everyone. Welcome back to The Dirt. We are in the heart of planting season across most of the United States. A lot of decisions being made and people trying to figure out exactly what their best production plans are. One of the things that everybody's trying to figure out is soil fertility, and do they need starter fertilizers? To help us work through this issue of starter fertilizers, we have Dr. Alan Blaylock, Senior Agronomist with Nutrien, with us today. Alan, welcome back to The Dirt.
Thanks, Mike. I think we've got an interesting topic today.
Alan, if you will, just remind our listeners who you are and what you do.
I'm Senior Agronomist with Nutrien. I'm based in Colorado, and I spend a lot of my time in about the western half of the U.S., the Pacific Northwest, the Great Plains, and the western Corn Belt, Northern Plains, providing agronomy support to our customers and our marketing efforts and really all kinds of educational activities around soil fertility and nutrient management.
Okay, Alan, well, let's start off this episode and do a little bit of defining what we mean by some of these terms. I hear the word starter fertilizer thrown out there. I hear pop-up fertilizers. I know people put out fertilizer in a band. And talk a little bit about these application methods and what we really mean when we're talking about starter fertilizers.
Well, Mike, the term starter can be used fairly broadly, and it may be used to refer to a variety of different applications. So let's kind of sort that out. When we're talking about a starter fertilizer, we're really referring to an application that's made at planting, generally pretty low rates of fertilizer that are intended to give that seedling a boost as it's germinating and getting started in its life cycle. Now, some of these other terms like pop-up or in-furrow may be specific types of starter applications. We can also apply starters in a band off to the side of the row. Something that's common there is what we call 2x2, and that simply means 2 inches over from the seed and 2 inches below the seed, so 2x2. And these terms may be used a little differently in different parts of the country, but pop-up, as I know it, is usually used to refer to an application that's placed in the seed row in contact with the seed. The name suggests that it's going to provide some benefit to getting that seed to pop up, get developed, get growing out of the ground. But pop-up, to me, is usually used in the same way that something we call in-furrow application, which is also referring to fertilizer or sometimes chemicals, crop protection chemicals, sometimes placed in furrow. That means in the seed row with the seed in that seed furrow. So pop-up and in-furrow kind of being used synonymously. And then we have this 2x2 kind of placement. Sometimes the term sideband might be used, simply referring to banding nutrients off to the side of the row. We also have sometimes, maybe less common as a starter, but what we might call a surface band or a dribble band, where a liquid fertilizer is dribbled on the surface, called banding. And that simply refers to placing fertilizer in a band. And a starter is a type of band application. A pop-up is a type of band application. So we have at the highest level this term banding. And then we go to starter, which is a broader type of banded application specifically related to this early low-rate application to get the seedling started. And then we have pop-up and in-furrow, which are kind of a subset of this starter concept. So hope that kind of helps our listeners sort it out. But there may be different terms used in different parts of the country, and just it's important that we make a distinction sometimes, because the fertilizers that we use or the method of application may be different for some of these different types of starter applications.
Alan, you talked a lot about placement when you went through that. You talked about a 2x2 placement or an in-furrow placement. Talk a little bit about the importance of placement and when you would opt for a 2x2 or something off of the seed row versus an in-furrow application.
So, Mike, the reason we use these applications, so let's step back again to what I said earlier. The purpose of these applications is to provide a dose of nutrients, usually quite a small dose of nutrients, to that developing seed. So we have some nutrition there as that seedling germinates and starts to grow. So the placement that we use is going to be determined partly by our equipment, obviously, partly by our fertilizers, and then partly by the crop that we're trying to grow and what we want to achieve with that application. There are limitations on some of these applications based on the fertilizer choices that we have. So keeping in mind that fertilizers are soluble salts, and if we have too much in close contact with the seed, then that can be hazardous to that seed. The salt effect of those fertilizers can limit germination and impair root growth. And so if we're putting it directly on the seed, we can only use very small amounts. If we move it away from the seed a little bit, like a 2x2 placement where we have a couple inches of separation, now we can increase the amount substantially of how much fertilizer we can apply. But again, keep in mind the goal is really a small dose of fertilizer to get the crop started.
Alan, you mentioned some of the effects of putting that in furrow right on with the seed and increasing that salt load right there with those developing roots. These days everybody is looking at biological products or inoculants going out with legumes. Talk a little bit about some of the potential watch outs if we're putting out fertilizer in contact with the seed that has some of these biological traits with it.
That's a great topic, Mike, because often we want to put other things in that starter fertilizer. We may want to put a biostimulant or a biological product with that fertilizer. The fertilizer can make a great carrier for some of those products. And inoculants like we use for legumes. But it's important to keep in mind that fertilizer materials are a pretty harsh environment for living organisms. So we want to be a little bit careful with that. If you have some kind of chemistry or biostimulant or biological organism that you're wanting to put in furrow in close proximity to the seed, you may be very limited on how much fertilizer you can use in that application. So you have to consult with the manufacturer to check on compatibility. Will that material you're providing in the fertilizer cause any undesirable chemical reactions? Will there be toxicities on living organisms? So we need to pay attention to that and always consult with the manufacturer. And there may be certain chemical incompatibilities, and we always want to jar test those materials. What we mean by that is simply taking small samples of each and mixing them in a jar and seeing if they're compatible, or if they make a gob of goo in the bottom of that jar, that's not going to be suitable for combining into that starter application. So we're always going to have questions about compatibility, and there are a variety of sources that growers or applicators can turn to look up in charts and check on compatibility of certain materials, but not everything's going to be listed there. So again, check with the manufacturers on compatibility, do the jar test, and make sure that you're not putting things together that, one, are not going to be compatible, but also, secondly, not have an undesirable effect on the other materials. Because, again, fertilizers are salt solutions. They're pretty concentrated salt solutions, and they can have negative effects on other materials that are being used with them.
Howell, a prime example of that goes back to my peanut days. We put an inoculant out with the peanuts pretty regularly, just about on every acre we planted. But we never recommended putting anything else out with that inoculant. We wanted that to be an independent application. Didn't want anything else mixed with that because it was so fragile, and we didn't want to do anything to harm that inoculant. So I agree. We need to check with the manufacturer, make sure they have the data that says we can mix that if we're doing anything like that. Alan, I guess the next thing we need to dive off into is, why do we want to use a pop-up fertilizer? You talked about maybe getting it out of the ground, or a starter fertilizer. Talked about getting the crop out of the ground earlier. What are some of the benefits, and is it going to work every time? What do growers need to know about that?
One of the main things we're trying to establish with a starter fertilizer is get a zone with a little bit higher nutrient concentration close to those plant roots. Why is that important? Well, early in the season, our soils are typically cooler. and a number of nutrients, particularly phosphorus. We talk a lot about phosphorus with starters. Phosphorus is supplied to the roots by something we call diffusion, and that process is very much slower in cold soils. So by making this fertilizer placement close to the plant roots, we can improve the availability of phosphorus for a young plant that doesn't have a lot of roots, and we're trying to get that growing. So phosphorus is one that we particularly focus on with starters, but those same principles also apply to potassium and to many of our micronutrients that aren't very mobile in the soil. So getting those close to the plant row, and they're more concentrated in a band, so that increases the concentration in the soil that the plant roots will encounter, and that can increase availability and uptake. And the whole purpose of getting better uptake is to give the plant better nutrition and get it growing a bit faster, get it off to a good start. And things like phosphorus stimulate early root growth and development. So having a good concentration of phosphate there, not too much. As we said, these are relatively low rates, small amounts, but we're elevating that concentration right near the roots and giving them a bit of a boost to help stimulate early root development, early vegetative growth, and again, remembering that a lot of these plants are beginning to establish yield potential fairly early in the season. So we want to set a good environment for them. Now, starters can have multiple benefits, and it may not always translate to yield. So getting early growth and development can help reduce disease infection. Growing a healthy plant, growing it faster, tends to reduce its susceptibility to diseases, so that can be a benefit. One thing that's also been shown is that getting that earlier start, better plant nutrition early, getting the crop, that plant off to a good start, can often translate to earlier maturity. Well, what does that mean to the grower? Well, that may mean less grain drying costs. If we get the plant matured faster, earlier dry down can save us a little money on grain drying. And that can be observed even in the absence of a yield response. So yes, ultimately, oftentimes starters can translate to a higher yield, but not always, but there may be other benefits. Another benefit we could think about is if we can apply smaller amounts of these nutrients in the ground, in a band close to the plant row, we maybe can apply less as a broadcast application in the fall, for example. Lots of growers apply phosphorus and potassium in the fall. They're broadcasting that, and oftentimes on the surface in no-till, and that's susceptible to losses that can lead to environmental problems. So by putting part of that or some of it, maybe even all of it, in a band close to the plant, it's in the ground, it's going to be less affected, less susceptible to those losses. So that could be another benefit of starters that may not necessarily translate to yield, but is still has value and improves the efficiency of our nutrient use. Mike, I want to come back to something that we hit on, but I maybe need to say a few more words about that. We're talking about compatibility of materials, and sometimes it may be necessary to put some products in furrow through the planter, and many planters today have attachments and are equipped to place some of these materials in the seed row with the seed, and separating our starter application, say 2x2. So we may have some things that are not compatible with fertilizer going through the planter into the seed furrow, and some things that are going through a separate opener off to the side of the row, so that they're separated. And then we don't have the concerns about compatibility, and we still get the starter benefit while getting the value of that other product that may not be compatible with fertilizer. So it may require some special equipment setups, but most of our modern planters are capable of doing this, and we can add extra attachments to achieve different things depending on what we're trying to accomplish and the materials that we're wanting to use.
Great point, Alan. Al, I guess the next question I have is, we have 17 essential plant nutrients. Are there some that lend themselves better to a starter application, or is there some that you want to stay away from in a starter application?
Well, our main concern with these nutrients, again, in terms of the potential risks, would be the salt index of the fertilizer. So that's something we look at. Materials of higher salt index we want to be aware of that risk, and those are going to be less suitable for the in-furrow or pop-up type of applications, or they may be just fine for the 2x2 or the sideband application. The nutrients where we tend to get the most benefit, or usually we're focusing on, as we mentioned, phosphorus, but also the micronutrients, because again, most of the micronutrients are immobile in the soil. They don't diffuse very fast, and we're applying them at low rates anyway. So having those in a starter band, it can be a really good way to apply the micronutrients. I have some of my own experience with that from my university days, and I can just say in some of the work I was doing, we always got a response to a starter application of zinc, but we rarely got a response to broadcast zinc. So that's an example of some of the value that we could gain from a starter application. I will also say, while we focus a lot on phosphorus and some of these other things, that these immobile nutrients, there was also some work done here maybe about 15 years, 20 years ago. And I think there's been some more recent research with this as well that indicate that boosting a little bit more nitrogen in the starter can also be beneficial. Lots of guys apply, a few gallons of 10-30-4-0. They get a little bit of nitrogen and phosphorus in about a 1-to-3 ratio. And sometimes that may be all they're using as their starter. But there is some evidence in the research that maybe a 1-to-1 nitrogen to phosphorus ratio can be even a little better. And then again, in some other recent research, a little bit of potassium in that starter might be beneficial. Now, as we start adding more nutrients, we're getting more salts in that solution, and that may require us to move to more of the 2x2 or sideband application instead of on the seed, in furrow, or pop-up kind of application. So just want to be aware of that. The more we're putting in that starter application, the more risk we're going to create for salt effects and potential inhibition of the germination. So we want to look at different things, but really, in my opinion, there's a lot of nutrients that could benefit from a starter application.
Alan, you mentioned this a couple of times. You've talked about the salt effects, and we don't want to get too much salts in there. How can a grower know the salt index and how much is safe to put out?
Mike, there's lots of resources a grower can turn to. There are tables. You can look up that salt index, and for comparison purposes, take a look at some of the materials. Again, just some broad guidelines. The more soluble the material is, generally the higher salt effect it's going to have. And then we have some things like urea, and remembering UAN solution, urea ammonium nitrate solution, contains some urea. And another effect of urea is it's going to evolve some free ammonia as it starts to react with the soil. So that's a secondary effect to the salts. But there are some things that have high salt index, like potassium chloride. Most of our potash is potassium chloride. That's got a pretty high salt index. A potassium sulfate, on the other hand, has quite a bit lower salt index because it's somewhat less soluble. We look at ammonium sulfate. It has a really high salt index. There may be other materials we could use that have less risk and a lower salt index. So that's something we want to take a look at. There are tables. You can look those up. There are some general rules of thumb around this. And for example, one that I've heard for virtually my entire career is for corn, the amount you can put on the seed in the seed row, N plus K, should not exceed 10 pounds per acre. Actual units of N plus K, that total should not exceed 10 pounds. Well, that's a general rule of thumb. Soil and moisture conditions, all these other things might vary that up or down, but that's kind of a starting point. I know South Dakota State University has an excellent calculator for seed-safe rates, and you can put in a variety of different fertilizers. They did a lot of laboratory incubation studies to see what levels would be safe. And so that's a pretty good calculator that you can find with a simple Google search just by looking at South Dakota State University seed safe rates, something to that effect. You can pull that right up, and it's an online tool. Put in your own numbers and you can calculate out what's safe. But generally speaking, I've used very high rates in 2x2 placement with no effect. As long as you can guarantee you've got 2 to 3 inches of separation from the seed, you can put some fairly high rates there, even rates far beyond what we would consider starter rates. Again, looking at solubility of the materials, the salt index of the materials, do they contain an ammonium source that might, or a urea source that might evolve some free ammonia that could be create an additional risk. But these are some of the things we want to look at. And also, I should add to that, Mike, crops vary widely in their sensitivity. So it helps to understand a little bit about the crop. We look at something like wheat and barley, they have a higher tolerance of some of these materials, where corn and soybeans are pretty sensitive. Cotton, I believe, also has a higher tolerance of some of these salts. So you have to know the crop, and there are also resources where you can look that up. But follow your guidelines, and this is something you don't want to create a lot of risk, because the last thing you want is to destroy part of your stand and have to go replant. That's absolutely not worth it. If the risk isn't known, be safe and go off to the side rather than with the seed.
Alan, that kind of leads me to my last question, and that has to deal with crops. Do some crops respond better to starter fertilizers, or are there some crops that you absolutely do not want to put a starter fertilizer?
Well, I can't think of a crop I would absolutely not want to use a starter. I can't think of an answer to that part of the question. In terms of crops that would respond, we often think about row crops when we're thinking about starters, but there are a lot of crops that will respond, and I think it's more dependent on the soil condition and our nutrient levels and factors related to root growth. Do we have conditions that are going to impair the root growth? And typically cold soils is one of those conditions. So if I'm planting early in cool soils, that's often a prime target for starters, regardless of what the crop is. If we have low nutrient levels in the soil, we're going to get a better benefit from starters and boosting that concentration close to that seedling. Anything that could impair root growth, if we have compaction or high bulk densities or lots of residue cover, which again goes to the soil temperature, the soil is going to warm up more slowly. These are environments where starters are likely to be more beneficial. So it's more related to the soil conditions and our planting times and those kinds of things. But speaking of planting times, I think back to some of the work that I did with starters and a study that I ran across. It was a cotton study. I don't remember exactly where it was from, but the general hypothesis was, well, we should see a better benefit of starters on early planting rather than later, because those later plantings, the soil's warmed up. We expect them to develop quickly, and, everything's going to be fine. But the interesting thing in that study is they got just as good a response to starters in the later plantings as they did in the early plantings. And maybe for a different reason. The early plantings, nutrient availability and uptake limited by cool soils and slower root development. But in the later plantings, that crop developed a lot faster, and it had a higher nutrient demand. So the starter was able to give it what it needed. And so in the work I did, I didn't see a difference in planting date. I got just as good a starter response, whether it was early planted or late planted, but maybe for different reasons. So take a look at those conditions. Do you have conditions that may limit availability of certain nutrients? That's an environment where you want to put those nutrients in a starter. You have low soil tests, all of these things that we mentioned, and not so much related to the crop. I think many crops could benefit if you have conditions that maybe impair root growth or root availability in that seedling development. Those are prime candidates for starter use and likely to give a benefit.
Well, Alan, I know we've covered a lot of information here in just a short time. Do you think we've covered everything, or do you have anything else we need to talk about before we wrap this segment up?
Well, we've covered a lot. Personally, from my own experience and things I've learned in the literature, I like starters. I generally would recommend them. There may be cases where there might not be a benefit. And one case comes to mind that we didn't talk about. We talked about row crops, but I think of one example where a starter application could be really beneficial, and that's in winter wheat. Usually with winter wheat, we want to get those tillers established in the fall if possible, and nitrogen and phosphorus both stimulate tiller development. So that may be a case where putting a little bit of nitrogen and phosphorus, and it's often done in wheat, it's often done in the seed row because we don't need a lot, and it has a fairly good tolerance. We can put a pretty healthy dose of N and P in the seed row. You just have to watch your safe limits. But that's an example where it's a little different, but it's still a starter kind of application. We're still giving a boost to that early nutrition. And so, again, as I said, from my own experience, I like starters, and I think they're usually worth looking into at least and considering your conditions. And if your equipment will achieve that for you, I like that application personally. It doesn't take a lot to achieve that benefit. So I think there's usually a good return on investment to those starter applications.
Well, Alan, we really appreciate you taking time to visit with us today. I know I've learned a lot from this episode. I hope our listeners have as well. And listeners, thank you for hanging around and listening to this episode. We really hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Also, if you need more information on starter fertilizers, you can visit our eKonomics website. That's eKonomics.com. We have a starter fertilizer toolkit, and we have several articles in there that dive a lot deeper into starter fertilizers. If you will, please hang around for just a couple of moments, and we'll be right back with segment 2. Farming isn't farming without questions, and now there's a place to go for answers. At eKonomics, an entire team of agronomists is waiting and ready to help for free. No question is too big or too small. Visit Nutrien-eKonomics.com and submit your question with the Ask an Agronomist feature. Listeners, welcome back for segment 2. Segment 2 of The Dirt is where we ask an agronomist a question of the week. This week, to help us with that, we've got Lyle Howell back with us. Lyle, welcome back to The Dirt.
Well, thanks for having me again, Mike. Always great to be on.
Lyle, it's spring, and there's a lot of planters in the field trying to get this crop planted. We did get a question that came in from a farmer, and I think he was up in your region, wanting to put some nitrogen. I think he was looking at the ESN form of this nitrogen and wanting to put that in a blend with some MAP plus MST and maybe a few other things. And he got a little concerned that he may be getting the fertilizer too hot. Talk a little bit about what he means by getting the fertilizer too hot, and then talk about seed row safety and what somebody needs to understand before they put fertilizer down in furrow with the seed.
You bet, Mike. It's a very important question. In the farming system that we've adopted in Western Canada, which would include a lot of the northern states, using air drills, trying to very much minimize soil disturbance to retain soil water, and also do this quickly and efficiently in terms of fertilizer application and seeding. We've adopted a system where we apply fertilizer directly in the seed row. So now, what fertilizer do we apply? Usually we focus on nutrients that are slowly available. Our soil's often very cold in spring, and some nutrients just are not readily available unless you have them right near the developing seedling root system. And those nutrients, first off, are phosphorus, and secondly, potassium. In our soils, in our conditions, phosphorus availability can be very slow in the spring, largely because the soils are cold, and also because we're trying to supply the phosphorus to a very small developing root system, which is affected by the cold soil as well. And again, potassium also tends to move very slowly in our cold soil in spring. So those are the two nutrients we tend to focus on. The specific question was related to safe rates of MAP plus MST and or ESN. And I had a good chat with the farmer and tried to sort this out. Now, when I would encourage agronomists that are asked this question in the terms of what is the safe rate of fertilizer to apply near seed when seeding, you have to ask some questions. There's not one right answer to this question. You have to ask two primary questions. What are you seeding with, and what is the spread of the fertilizer and seed? Are you trying to squish all the seed and fertilizer into a 3/4 inch opener, or is it being spread over 3 or 4 inches? If it's spread over a wider area, your safety increases with every bit that you can spread the fertilizer and seed. A lot of the questions, though, do come from fellows that are using a very narrow opener, a 3/4 or 1 inch opener. Now, the most important soil question is soil moisture. If the soil has lots of moisture, it dilutes the effect of the fertilizer, and that is a huge factor. So, in fact, even within a field, you might have parts that your safety is going to be greater than other parts of the field. So the drier knolls of a landscape might have lower safe rates than the lower parts of the field. So there has to be that thinking that Is it acceptable to thin some of the crop in some parts of the field, but not in other parts of the field? What we're worried about here is having the fertilizer prill or granule right against the seed. If we have a dense combination of seed and fertilizer and they're actually directly contacting, that seed will either germinate slowly or may not germinate at all. We get wrapped up in the term salt index of fertilizers. It's an important term. It's terribly misused in our fertilizer industry. Salt index is a measure of fertilizer solubility. Really, a high salt index is a good thing because it means that the nutrients in that fertilizer are highly available. But if you have a fertilizer with a high salt index and it's near the seed, it increases the risk of the fertilizer in the seed row. So you have to ask, what are you seeding with? Do you have good soil moisture? And which crops are you seeding? Because a crop like flax or canola has a much higher risk to seed row fertilizer than a crop like barley, for example. You have to ask all those questions. For me to say that 25 pounds of phosphorus is safe, that's a wrong answer some of the time. You have to have those conversations with the farmer to make sure that you're giving as much advice as you can. And there also has to be an acceptance that fertilizer is going to have some impact on seed germination at all rates. Sometimes it's so tiny that you cannot measure it. But what we're really trying to gain is a level that is not going to reduce crop yield or the rate of maturity. So we just don't want to damage it to an excessive amount. So we're trying to balance the goodness of having fertilizer near the seed and also reduce the risk of having fertilizer near the seed. Now, ESN is highly safe to seed. It's 3 or 4 times safer than urea in the seed row. If you want to apply nitrogen in the seed row, ESN is a fantastic solution, and there's a number of reasons why farmers might want to do that. MAP plus MST, primarily we're looking at the safe rate of phosphorus in the seed row. There is sulfur in MAP plus MST, but that sulfur is elemental sulfur, so the risk from that sulfur is negligible in terms of crop safety. So when it comes to MAP plus MST, we're just really taking that step back and asking yourself, what is the safe rate of monoammonium phosphate, 1152, in terms of phosphorus rates with that particular crop? Not much of an answer. I just provide a lot more questions, I think, in my answer, Mike.
Lyle, you gave us a lot to think about and a lot to understand before we do this. We don't want to do anything that's going to harm that developing seedling when it's trying to get through that soil surface and start growing. So great answer there, Lyle. Listeners, we appreciate you tuning in for this week's episode. And as always, if you have any questions about anything we've talked about today, you can visit our website. That's Nutrien-eKonomics.com. Until next time, this has been Mike Howell with The Dirt. Hey guys, if you like what you heard today, do us a favor and share this podcast with someone else. It could be your neighbor, your friend, your crop advisor, or whoever you think would enjoy it. Your support helps ensure future episodes, so please like, subscribe, share, and rate the show wherever you're listening from.